The man said a boy's spirit was not so easily broken, and the Signora replied that she did not think it had been done easily, but they had succeeded in the end. The man thought she ought to do something about it. If the child was really wretched, he said, and was wandering about by himself, it was their duty to inquire into his circumstances and help him. But the Signora only said, "What can I do to help a broken heart? And as for his circumstances, I've no right to interfere. He could be given money, so that could go by train to join the circus and wouldn't have to walk, but neither you nor I have any money to spare, Pierre, and it won't do the boy any harm to walk. Anyway, I gather he thumbs lifts most of the way. That's what they generally do these days." When the stranger had gone, David went downstairs and found the Signora and breakfast ready for him. Then he sat for her again, and while they were resting after lunch, she said she would look through her books. He did not settle down to reading anything. However, there was a large photograph album on the bookcase. There were photographs from many countries, and some of them had names of the places written underneath. There were photographs of people as well, and in some of them he could recognise the Signora. Some of the pictures lay loosely in the album, and from the back of the book, one bigger than the rest fell out. David did not know how long he could be sitting with it in his hand when the Signora came in. "Who's that?" he asked as he saw her and showed her the photograph. "That's a friend of mine. She's called Edith Jorth Fengel. Will you tell me about her?" "What for?" "Because her eyes look as if she's known a great deal, and yet she's still smiling." "You're a sharp boy, David. Her story is mostly a sad one. She lived abroad with her husband in a country where the political situation made it necessary to be very careful. And her husband wasn't. It's a very grown-up story, David, which I hope you're still not old enough to understand. One night the police arrested them, all three of them, her husband, herself and the little boy who was then only a year old. He was the one who was called David, just like you, and whom I never saw. They killed her husband and the child, and Edith only got away because one of her guards knew her and was in love with her. He got papers for her and smuggled her across the frontier, and now she lives at home in Denmark and is as well as you can be once you've been through great unhappiness. All suffering has an end. David, if only you wait long enough. Try to remember that. Sorrow has its life just like people. Sorrow is born and lives and dies, and when it's dead and gone, someone's left behind to remember it, exactly like people." The wind was blowing icy cold, and the snow was falling so thickly that David could not see his hands in front of him. He knew he had very little strength left, and yet he struggled on step by step. He was determined not to die. He would go on and on until he came to Denmark and found the woman whom he knew must be his mother. He would let nothing stand in his way now. Neither snow nor cold nor mountains would stop him. He was David, a boy on the run, but one who now knew where he was going to. The day before he had left in a car from Luango, but when they reached a place called Fado, the driver would not go any further. The weather was bad, he said, and the pass would be closed. David had slept in a stable outside the town, and that morning he had trudged on, the road climbing up, and the air growing colder and colder until at last the snow came. The Danish woman had gone. The Danish woman had told him he would go back to her when she returned from Rome. She had said he was to ask if there was any way in which she could help him, and she had added that if he did not care for the circus and had no near relatives to go to, she would have him to live with her. But David only had half listened to what she was saying. Fortunately, he was well used to hiding his thoughts and feelings. He had answered politely and remembered to thank her, and had behaved just as if nothing had happened. He had told her he had an uncle in the circus who was very nice to him. He had told her all the lies he could lay tongue to, and no longer felt it was wrong of him. He had to get to Denmark, and he would have to lie himself out of any situation that stood in his way or might lead them on his tracks. Hadn't the Frenchman talked about investigating the circumstances? Nothing and no one could stop him now, yet he knew himself that the Danish Signora would have understood if he could have told her. He had asked her the name of the camp guard, and it was the man. David understood everything now, or nearly everything. The man had saved the woman's life because he liked her in a way grown-up people like those they wanted to marry. He had not saved her husband because he hated him for being her husband. He had saved David's life because he was her child. He had not told her the child was still alive. However, perhaps because he could get papers for one through, David did not think that could be the whole reason. They also wanted revenge. Because the woman did not care for him, the man had got his revenge by turning David into a boy from a concentration camp. Yes, that's how it was. And yet the man had seen to it that he did not die. He had given him milk and vitamins and had also insisted that the boy knows nothing. David began to understand a lot of things now. They had let Johann starve and freeze and made him work, even when he fell ill. But apart from that, they had not ill-treated him as they had their other prisoners. And David had believed that they could not lay hands on Johann when he looked him straight in the eye. But he now saw that it was not the only thing. The man had seen to it that Johann should be there to look after David. Johann said the older one grew, the more complicated and involved one's feelings became, and sometimes they quite opposed to one another, as for example, when they would like to stay awake, but felt at the same time that they wanted to fall asleep. That was how the man had felt. He had hated David on account of his mother, who would have nothing to do with him, and at the same time he had looked after him also on account of his mother. And that was how David himself felt about the man. No one had bribed the man. There was no one to do it, since nobody knew of David's existence. And if you knew anything about them, then you knew too the danger the man had risked in letting a prisoner escape, and yet he had done it. David's steps grew slower and slower. He had lost all feeling in his feet now, and he was soaked to the skin. The snow continued falling. He felt an irresistible urge to lie down, if only for a moment, but he dared not give way. He might die of cold out in the snow. He could no longer follow the road. Everything was covered in snow, and he could see nothing at all through the thickly falling flakes. There had not been a signpost for a long time. At last his mind grew numb, and as on the road to Salonika, his feet carried him along quite unconsciously. Suddenly there was nowhere in front of him to set the foot. David threw himself backwards, fell and rolled over. A precipice! He had nearly walked over the edge. Before he had become so exhausted he had been well aware of the danger, but the snow had begun falling. He had seen how easy it was to miss one's footing and go hurtling down the mountainside. Not for 1 second could he afford to relax his attention. He no longer dared to walk, so he crawled onwards on all fours, feeling his way carefully with his hands to make sure he was not near the edge of the precipice. He did not know how many hours passed in this way. He ached all over, and the snow continued to swirl about him in the howling gale that seemed to cut into his head. He was blinded and deafened, and the pain of his aching body grew so intense he felt he could not last another minute. It was worse than anything he could think of, worse than the camp, worse even than them. He could not call for God to help him, for the words were blown away inside his head, swept away into the howling gale and the blinding white hell all around him. There was no way out but to die. David struck his head against something hard. He fell, and then it snowed no more. A voice cried, "What kind of a young thief's this staggering about in this sort of weather?" With difficulty, David opened his eyes sufficiently to realise he had come across one of them. Then he knew no more. That winter was the longest David had ever experienced. The farmer was an evil-hearted man. David had escaped from the wind and the snow only to be prisoner in this man's house. It was the stable door he had struck his head against, and the stable became his shelter for the winter, and no very good shelter either. All day long he had to work and slave as hard as he could, and a bit harder if possible. The farmer was just like one of them. He used threats to force David to work, and said he would hand him over to the police if he did not obey. David had now learned how the members of the family spoke to one another, pleasantly and smilingly. There was nothing like that here. The farmer was cold and brutal, even to his wife and 2 children, but David could not feel any particular sympathy for them, for the wife was a clumsy, silent woman with a sharp edge to her tongue, and as for the children, David had never thought it possible for anyone who was still a child to be so evil. The boy was younger. He looked just like his father. He had stiff, straw-coloured hair and very pale blue eyes. And when he played, he either destroyed something or got into mischief.